Hello and welcome to Corfe Historia's second video. Today we're going to be focusing on Corfe Castle, and as you can see from these pictures, it is just a stunning Gothic ruin. It didn't always look that way. It was actually destroyed by the parliamentarians, but we'll get into all that later. But I mean, doesn't it look like something that Dracula would live in? Really, you would not be thinking it was out of place in any kind of Gothic film. But the castle itself is about 1,000 years old. It has stood during some of the most momentous periods of British history. It's seen the murder of a 13-year-old boy king by his stepmother, who wanted to put her son on the throne. It's also seen the, death by starvation in the dungeons of 22 French soldiers. You know, we weren't too kind to the French and they weren't too kind to us, to be frank. But today we're going to be focusing on, in my opinion, its most important inhabitant, who was called Mary Banks. But she's also known to history, although is often overlooked, as brave Dame Mary Banks. And we're going to be getting a little into why she's so important, why she was such an impressive woman, and as always, and as I'm going to prove to you throughout definitely the next few episodes, an incredible woman that has been massively overlooked by history. So I hope you enjoy it. So our story really starts at the start of the English Civil War. Now, Mary and her husband Sir John Banks bought the castle behind me. They weren't aristocrats, but they were very wealthy. They were prominent royalists at the time. And Mary seems to be quite a prudent person. As soon as the English Civil War started to heat up, she retreated back here to Corfe Castle. She thought there was a relative safety here. It was out of the way, it was not near any areas where she thought there would be fighting. But as you can see, Corfe Castle itself, whilst it's today a ruin, it was once an incredibly strong fortress, but it was outdated even for the standards of those times. It was made out of stone, it was incredibly drafty and not very many home comforts, but you can imagine at least it provided some amount of safety from the turbulence and uncertainty in places like London.
You're so photogenic.
You impressed by the castle, Dougal?
So there had been a tradition in the area for many, many years of a May Day stag hunt. So to act as if, you know, carry on, keep calm and carry on the 1st of May, Mary led a party out hunting a stag. I mean, it sounds idyllic, well, apart from the poor stag. But unfortunately, they'd only gotten a little way out from the castle when they were alerted that there was a group of men approaching from Dorchester. Mary and her group raced back to the castle and made it minutes before the group of soldiers arrived. So Mary and her group raced back to the castle as fast as they possibly could, and by all accounts they only arrived a few minutes before all the soldiers arrived. And when the soldiers did arrive, apparently they stood outside the gate swearing, demanding to be let in. But I mean, this wasn't unforeseen. Now, at this point, I think it's fairly important to note that Mary's husband was not in the castle at the time. She was only there with her daughters, I think about 5 men and some maids. And the soldiers were putting pressure on her to give up her only 4 cannons. That's all the defence she had, so she didn't want to do that. She compromised. She said she would take them off their kind of perches, but she didn't want to give them up. So early one morning, Mary was awoken to the news that there were 40 soldiers at her gate. This was not something she was expecting. She obviously had to go down in the very early hours of the morning and see what the situation was. The soldiers, unsurprisingly, were demanding that she hand over her 4 cannon. And it must be said, these cannon were absolutely tiny. They weren't going to provide any real defence, but they probably made her feel a bit safer as the only person in charge at the castle at the time. Anyway, the men produced a warrant, which was the worst case scenario because it meant she had to hand them over. Or risk sanctions, I suppose. But anyway, she decided that this was just a step too far. She'd been pushed past the breaking point. This was the last straw. She, rather wonderfully, ordered the 5 men that were in the castle, helped by her ladies' maids, to load the cannons and fire on the men at the gate. So bearing in mind, this is a woman with only 5 men and her daughters with their maids in the castle, firing on 40 parliamentarian soldiers outside. It must have been an incredible sight, to be honest. And they obviously weren't expecting the woman to fight back. You know, to them, she was an undefended woman in a society at the time which was completely male-dominated, male-led. It was men that led armies into battle. It was men that were the defenders of the stronghold. So they probably saw her as a really easy target. But she proved them wrong. And they went away. Fair play to her. Okay, so cue a brief interlude for a roast dinner and a beer. And go. Okay, so the sharp-eyed of you may notice that A, it looks a bit more wintry, B, I look a bit different, C, the outfit's different. That's because as soon as you saw the last shot, my camera died. So in fact, I've had to come back a few weeks later and finish filming. So apologise for the continuancy errors, but we'll continue now. So even though the men had left, the 40 soldiers that we talked about earlier, Mary knew, as I said, that it would only be a matter of time before they came back, so she decided to play them at their own game. She decided to give those cannon to them, the ones that were her only protection, but it wasn't because she suddenly had a change of heart and wanted to change sides. She knew that the castle was not prepared for a siege. She knew that she was currently surrounded still. You know, they might not be at her gate, but they were watching the castle and everything that went into and came out of it. So she bought herself some time to stock up. By giving them something they wanted, she was able to secretly stock up and prepare for a siege. And most importantly, she was able to call for help, call for the royalists to come to her. Unfortunately, they didn't have time before the nearest attack came. This is my dad, who is about to get very overexcited by the steam train going past. I mean, it is quite magical, but I mean, look how happy he is. There's only so many things that can put a smile on his face like that, and steam trains are one of them. As soon as the soldiers had left, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Mary might feel safe, might feel a little reassured that she was going to be safe within her castle walls. But, I mean, actually she knew that realistically Corfe Castle was a major stronghold. It would be a real prize for any parliamentarians that managed to capture it. So she immediately called the townspeople to her aid. She started banging a drum, desperately calling anyone to her aid that would help. But I think the townspeople were quite noticeably reluctant, purely because they'd already been threatened by the parliamentarians that if they helped in any way Mary, they would be subject to, I think a polite way to say it is sanctions. I mean, even if the castle itself would hold out for a siege, there was no guarantee that their property, which was obviously on the outside of the castle walls, would be left intact. Okay, so here we can see that the town really is just outside of the castle gates, but as I said, that is absolutely no guarantee for its safety during a siege whatsoever. On the morning of the 23rd of June, Sir Walter Earl arrived with a company of about 600 parliamentarian soldiers. They positioned cannons on all the hills behind me here, surrounding the castle, maybe even the one that I'm on right now, I have no idea. But they started to fire upon the castle. They'd been told to give everyone in the castle absolutely no quarter. They weren't to show any mercy, no humanity, nothing like that. And the cannons themselves were being aimed at where the castle was least strong. We can only imagine how terrifying this must have been for Mary, her daughters, and really only a tiny amount of men inside. As you can see, luckily the only attackers anywhere near the castle today are the Wasp.
Oh, it's winter.
Yeah, we're lucky to live in a century where you're not being attacked except by a wasp. The hopes of the parliamentarians were raised slightly with the arrival of siege ladders, but the only problem was the parliamentarian soldiers themselves weren't very motivated to be the first over the walls on the siege ladders. You can understand why. I mean, most of these guys were not, you know, dedicated lifelong soldiers. So the leadership decided on a quite innovative approach, I think. They decided to get them very, very drunk, thinking this would enhance their bravery. So I'm sure anyone that's been out on a Saturday night after a few tequilas can understand their thinking. So
As the attack was renewed, it began really in two halves. One of the groups of soldiers attacking was attacking the middle ward, whilst the other was attacking what everyone knows as the upper ward, which was defended solely by the Lady Banks and her daughters with, I think, a few of her maids. And the women actually ended up throwing objects at the attackers, like hot coals and big stones, just to stop them climbing the ladders. So it wasn't exactly hand-to-hand combat, it was more stone-to-head combat. As the parliamentary commanders began to hear of reports that the king's forces were closing in on the area, well, one of the books in particular, although written by a descendant of Dame Mary Banks herself, so perhaps a little biased, states that Sir Walter started crying and ran away, abandoning his troops. Following their commander's frankly quite embarrassing retreat, the parliamentarian soldiers tried to shelter in the church in the village, hoping to find some kind of warmth, perhaps food and water, but by all accounts they were eating near where people were praying and being buried, so it's quite dishonourable, to be honest, isn't it? But their feast was interrupted. Reports stated that the king's troops were now only a few minutes away, so the swift departure of the parliamentarians was the last we'd see of them for a while. So the end of 1644 was a really hard time for Mary. John, her husband, had died, and Parliament was gradually increasing its chokehold on all the key areas around Corfe. And Corfe pretty much stood alone now as the only royalist stronghold in the area. Everyone else had fallen. Behind the walls of the castle, there was one officer who would soon turn traitor. His actions would herald not only the end of the siege, but also the destruction of a 1,000-year-old castle.
Before we go any further, I think it's quite important to note that there is a very famous legend surrounding Corfe Castle, one of many, to be honest. But it's that Mary Banks, before the castle was invaded, hid all her valuables, her gold plate, her jewels down the well of the castle. And of course most castles had wells at that point for, just such a situation. If they were under siege, how were they going to get water? But supposedly she hid all her valuables down this well, and that well was located just next to the sallyport door of the castle. And to the best of my knowledge, we know that a well existed there, but there is no proof that she left the treasure there. Now, I mentioned that sallyport door, and in probably the least accurate of terms, but the most simplistic, a sallyport door is the back door of the castle. And that sallyport door at Corfe would be crucial in the downfall of the castle. Now, a Lieutenant Pitman turned on Mary in the middle of the night. He led a group of soldiers from the outside of the castle through the sallyport door and into the castle itself. As far as we know, there were about 50 men, many of whom were local. They knew the layout of the castle, and kind of most crucially, they would also know which parts to take control of first in order to secure the castle for the parliamentary forces. And they did so in the middle of the night. I mean, you can imagine what a terrifying scenario this is. You would have been woken up in the middle of the night to an alarm being raised by your own men, realising that your castle was now invaded, you were no longer safe, and there really was no guarantee of your safety. If you remember, the soldiers outside had all basically said that they were going to spare no one, show no mercy whatsoever. Luckily, the lives of those in the castle were spared, and according to my research, it was really only down to the intervention of one commander who was from quite a well-respected local family in the area, who managed to get the invaders under control, ensure no one was hurt, and bloodshed was avoided. But it was at this point that Mary's time really was up. She had resisted for 3 years with very, very few people to defend the castle, but her time was up. Now that Corfe had fallen, the question was what to do with it. Remember, this is a really strategic point on the south coast, and Parliament couldn't risk it being occupied by royalist forces again. So they decided to slight the castle, which essentially means destroying it, just to send a message to royalists and also so that it could never pose a threat again. Their plan was to use explosives to try and break apart the really thick walls of the castle, but it took months because of the castle walls being so thick. Needless to say, all of the valuables and possessions of the Banks family were taken at that time, and the Lady Banks and her family would never live in the castle again. Lady Banks lived until the age of 57, eventually passing away in 1661, and thank God she lived just long enough to see the restoration of the monarchy that she had longed for throughout all those years of siege. She was buried near where she grew up in Ruislip. Mary wasn't forgotten when she died. Her legacy lives on, not least in her 11 children that she had during her lifetime, and her fortitude and her bravery, extreme bravery, were not forgotten by the beheaded king's son. Mary's own son was actually made a knight, and he would later build a massive country house near to Corfe, which is today owned by the National Trust, and it is called Kingston Lacy. Well worth a visit if you are intrigued by this story. Today Mary is known as Brave Dame Mary, and after watching that video I'm kind of hoping that you agree with that name. I know I certainly do. There are not many people that would have the bravery to hold a castle against an army with very few military personnel, with only their children and a few cannons, let alone hold it for weeks. So, an incredible woman. And the worst thing was, I was going to tell you that she was immortalised as Brave Dame Mary, but actually, she doesn't seem to be that well known. It was only my mum's recommendation that brought me to finding out more about her and knowing what she really did. And my mum only found out about her because of an archaeological dig she did at Corfe in the 90s. So I hope in a very tiny way this video will bring more recognition to Mary, the people that held the castle with her, and just the incredible woman that she was. So if you like this video, please feel free to click the link to subscribe and the like button, and we will be with you again very shortly in a month or so's time with another video. Bye for now.